Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're on Saga 960. Social change has been something that I've been fascinated with and passionate about for a long period of time. And I think during COVID-19, it's only become even more important. And so we're going to introduce you tonight to two interesting people that are leading something called the Foundation for Social Change. The first is Claire Williams. She is the co-founder and CEO of the Foundation for Social Change, and she's joining us from KITS in Kitsilano in Vancouver in BC. And the second is Dr. Jieying Zhao, an associate professor of psychology at UBC's Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. Hello, both of you. How are you?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having us here.
So maybe we could start with you, Claire Williams. Tell us a little bit about yourself, if you could, and how you got to co-found the Foundation for Social Change.
Yeah, so I have a background in environmental studies and economics, and then my master's in urban planning, and was working quite actively in that space here in British Columbia, doing a lot of rural planning. And then by a series of interventions, I ended up working for the private sector doing environmental assessment, which I realized wasn't aligned with who I am and what I wanted to do in the world. So I moved to India and I managed an orphanage for a little bit, and then came back to Vancouver and just knew that I wanted to continue making an impact here at home. Was dismayed by the number of folks who we were seeing increasingly visible, the increasing number of visibly homeless people on our streets, both here in Vancouver. I'm from back east, so I was traveling a lot to Ottawa and Toronto, and just thought that there had to be a better way to empowering people to move forward in their lives. And then my co-founder, Franz, and I were inspired by a TED Talk by a Dutch gentleman called Rutger Bregman. He talked about the power of basic income, but more generally, the power of direct cash transfers to empower people to move beyond poverty. And we got to thinking, why don't we try something like that here in the West? We keep on applying the same one-size-fits-all solution to not a homogenous problem. People are homeless for very different reasons. And we thought it was time for meaningful risk-taking to advance social change here in Canada.
Fascinating. Okay, and this cashless transfer is what? Sort of like a guaranteed annual income?
It's a derivative of, it's a more simple and elegant design. It's just a one-time lump sum of cash. And in this case, we gave 50 people who are recently homeless a one-time cash transfer of $7,500. And because nobody had done this before, we formed a partnership with Jieying and the University of British Columbia to run this project as a randomized control trial, because we knew the data would be really important to people, especially the skeptics.
Well, that's a great segue to introduce Dr. Jieying Zhao, Associate Professor of Psychology. Dr. Zhao, tell us how you got involved in this collaboration.
Yeah, I was introduced to Claire by a friend and colleague of mine who's CEO of the Street to Home Foundation, and so happy to meet Claire. We hit it off in our first conversation, and Claire told me their ideas of using direct cash transfer to reduce homelessness in Vancouver. And I said, this must be done. So I jumped on board right away. My research is on poverty and the cognitive and psychological impacts of poverty. We designed the experiment, the project, and Claire was very successful in fundraising for the pilot project, and we were able to launch the data collection in the spring of 2018.
And where are you on the completion of the study?
It's completed. So we have collected all the data. We're in the process of writing the manuscript, which will go through peer review.
And what did you find? Or can you not tell us yet?
We can absolutely tell you. So we went public with our results on October 7th, and we have been flooded with media inquiries from around the world. It's incredible how this project and our findings have gained traction. So let's talk about our outcomes. We primarily found that people moved into stable housing faster, ultimately spending fewer days homeless. People spent their money on rent, on food, on clothing, recurring medical bills. We saw that people people retained over $1,000 after 12 months, which is pretty remarkable in somewhere like Vancouver or the Lower Mainland, where the cost of living is quite high. And then we saw that people made wise financial choices. So counter to insidious stereotypes around people living in poverty or people who are experiencing homelessness, people actually reduced their spending on drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. So we saw that go down by 39%. And that's pretty remarkable.
Fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with these two interesting people talking about the Foundation for Social Change and direct cash transfers of, what was it, $7,500?
You got it.
To homeless people and how it could change their lives. Stay with us and more in just a minute. Well, fascinating conversation with Claire Williams, the co-founder and CEO of the Foundations for Social Change, and Dr. Jae-Young Zhao, an associate professor of psychology at University of British Columbia, the Institute for Resources, Environmental and Sustainability, talking about really social change and trying to get homeless people to make better decisions. And, maybe, Claire, I can ask you a couple of questions. I was told once by actually someone that was in Vancouver that it costs about $200,000 a year to keep someone homeless, effectively, to deal with homelessness in regards to, on average, the amount of times they come to a homeless shelter and food and how many times they end up going to an emergency room and stuff like that. Have you ever done an analysis to prove out what it costs society to have a person homeless?
Well, thank you for asking that question. So we didn't evaluate the cost of homelessness, but we drew on the existing research and literature. So depending on which study you look at from a Canadian context, it costs anywhere from $53,000 to $134,000 per person per year to exist in homelessness. So there's this common misperception around the general public that the cost of doing nothing or the status quo is free. But in fact, it is incredibly expensive. And so what we found for the population that we worked with, which was people who were recently homeless, giving them cash in advance actually generates a cost savings. So we saw that it actually saved the shelter system of care, those costs that you speak to, $8,100 over the course of 12 months. So in fact, it's more humane and it's more cost effective to give people money up front so that they can transform their lives.
I think a lot of people would be worried that if you gave people $7,500 up front, they'd waste it on drugs or a new TV or, who knows what. How do you have such comfort and confidence that they're going to make wise purchase decisions?
Yeah, well, we just look at our data, right? We see that people reduce spending on drugs, alcohol, and tobacco by 39%. So I think a lot of those assumptions that people make about how, quote unquote, homeless people are going to spend their money are wrong. They're based on stereotypes. They're based on caricatures that we see in movies or read in literature. And they're actually not representative of the real human beings behind the circumstance. So I think when you say homeless, people think of the stereotypical old guy with a scruffy beard kind of rooting through a garbage can. I've met people who are experiencing homelessness that look like you and I, people who have just fallen on hard times and who need that cash to move forward in their lives. And so one of the interesting findings from this is we're seeing that this beautiful data point, this 39%, fundamentally challenges harmful stereotypes that in my mind are preventing us from making any real progress or social change in this area, because we would rather believe the narrative that we've made up based on caricatures as opposed to the data and evidence.
If you had a certain percentage that improved their lives, was there a certain percentage that did waste the money?
Well, I wouldn't say waste, but there was a null effect for some participants. Absolutely. So some people, they had their family make demands on them. And so the money was given to family. And for some people, it wasn't the right intervention. And we're okay with that. It's, let's say, if you think of cancer, and if we develop a cancer drug, it only works for 65% of the population. Are we not going to administer the drug? No, we're going to give it to those 65%. And then we're going to look for a different solution for the remainder of that population. And it's the same thing with homelessness. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And that's currently how we approach the issue. So we're saying we all need to work together in a coordinated response to give people more bespoke ways of moving forward in their lives.
Dr. Zhao, Your resume says that you are the Canadian Research Chair in Behavioral Sustainability. What the heck is behavioral sustainability? What, keeping like your behaviors the same all the time and sustainable? What is that?
So I work up behavior change towards sustainability. This means financial sustainability or environmental.
I think we've lost the professor for a minute.
To move towards stability and sustainable livelihood.
Jiaying, we've lost you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to turn off my video. My internet is not. So, behavior change toward financial, environmental sustainability. So such as a cash transfer to people and stability.
Jiaying, you're still breaking up.
So maybe I could go back to you, Claire. I guess we've had a big experience with, almost a guaranteed annual income in this past year with the CERT that a lot of people are taking advantage of in Canada. I actually had a long-term conservative Senator Hugh Segal on my show talking about a guaranteed annual income. But I guess the difference between what you're talking about and what they're talking about is, ongoing weekly or monthly payments versus this upfront payment. Tell me why the upfront payment is, in your mind, preferable.
Yeah, and so for us as a charitable organization, it's preferable because it's more elegant, it's easier to implement, and quite frankly, it's cheaper. We are working with a very specific subset of the population, so with marginalized communities, and we really just wanted to test the power of one-time cash transfers. And what we see, I've spoken to Hugh, he's an incredible man, and he was supportive of our project. And I think what we're doing here is actually creating an evidence base and a justification for something like universal basic income.
You got the money from where?
We got our initial funding. We were successful on a $475,000 grant from the federal government. So that allowed us to take the idea from my kitchen table into a bona fide organization and hire a small team. And then we raised the rest of that money through private donors. So it's been incredible. Both private donors and some of Canada's leading foundations have really been excited and enthusiastic about this project because it does challenge a lot of the assumptions we make. Just as society in general, but also in the philanthropic space. And they could see the direct impact that their money was having on people's lives.
How did you find the recipients?
We did a screening process. So we, as Jiaying and I, neither of us had experience working frontline with people who are homeless, and we really value partnership. Partnership drives our work. So we worked with 4 leading organizations here in the Lower Mainland, and they helped us identify guests within their shelter who would fit our criteria. So we didn't just let anybody into the program for this initial pilot project. We did have screening criteria in place. And so we worked with folks who were less than 2 years homeless, ages 19 to 64, and then who had a degree of functionality. So no severe substance use, mental health, or alcohol use issues. And that was really because no one has ever tried direct cash transfers before with this population in the world. So we wanted to start small, get a bit of assurance, some lessons learned, and then through each subsequent iteration of the project, start expanding our parameters to see if it works with different populations.
Now, you said that one of the reasons why you included Dr. Zhao was because you wanted to do a clinical trial effectively on it. A typical clinical trial includes a control group. Did you have a control group?
We absolutely did. And it's a hard thing to have a control group when people are experiencing homelessness. We know that it is a very traumatic experience, and it's just something that's required in order to demonstrate impact from a randomized control trial.
So you had other people that were within this group had fit your criteria that you brought in and gave no money to?
Yeah, so we had 50 people who received the cash and then 65 people who did not receive the cash. They did receive some secondary supports like honorariums. So because this is a scientific academic study, we provided small cash payments every time we met with them to collect data. they also were offered free replacement ID, a free bank account with a local credit union, as well as a free smartphone.
So to transfer 7,500, people have got to have bank accounts. Most homeless people have bank accounts?
It's mixed. So that was why we built a partnership with our local credit union. And we also wanted to assure that, one, people weren't walking around with $7,500 in your pocket. That's not good for anybody to do. And two, that people weren't using money marts or going to banks where there's really high fees. For some of us, $8, $10 a month, it's not a big deal. But when you're living in poverty, that adds up. So Van City offered everybody a free checking account, which was great. It also allowed us to directly deposit the money into their bank account.
I had a fascinating interview with a recent immigrant to Canada. And I think you're an immigrant to Canada, so you might have some experience with this, I'm not sure, but a recent immigrant to Canada who ended up being homeless. And their biggest challenge was that they didn't have money for first and last month's rent. And they didn't have Canadian credit. And so they couldn't get a place to live. And so it was almost and they actually had cash, they had money. But because they had money, but they didn't have enough money for rent plus first and last month's rent and Canadian credit, they couldn't actually get a place to live.
Yeah, I think that beautifully illustrates why cash transfers can be beneficial. So if you think about income assistance, I'm not sure what the rates are in Ontario, but in British Columbia right now, it's $710 a month and $375 is pegged for your shelter. I don't know who is getting by on $700 a month, including their food, shelter, and everything else you need to survive. Not many people. So I think it speaks to the need for something like a cash transfer to empower people so they actually have that first and last month's rent. And I think it also, if we look at the Canadian government and what's happened with CERB and the pandemic, by benchmarking the CERB at $2,000, to me, that communicates that the Canadian government knows that is the bare minimum amount of money that people need to meet their basic needs. So why don't we have income assistance at that rate? And how can we hold these expectations that people are supposed to move forward in their lives with such a small amount of money?
Do you think if you're getting, $750 a month to $2,000 a month, you still have the incentive to get off of it and go to get a job?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you see some of the research from all over the world from any kind of basic income or direct cash transfer study. Again, this challenges those assumptions that people are layabouts and that they're not going to work. I don't know about you, but for me and some of our participants we've spoken to, work gives people incredible sense of meaning in their lives. It gives them purpose, and most people enjoy work. I think what they found with some universal basic income is that people might then give up work that's not as satisfying, retrain, and go into more skilled jobs. But by no means does it have a negative impact on employment rates.
Did you find any of these people doing things that other than housing that would positively impact their life? So anyone going back to school or taking courses or starting businesses, or what else did they do with the money?
Yeah, exactly those things. So people were going back to school there. If you look on our website, you'll see a video of Ray. And so Ray has started computer training classes, and then he wants to go on to be a mental health and addictions counselor to help people in community who need that extra support. We saw a number of people get their cars back on the road. So you have a car, but it's broken down and you're experiencing homelessness and you'd love to go back to work, but you're a skilled trade and you need a car to go back to work. It's that catch-22, you just can't get out of the cycle. So we saw a number of people use that money to get their car back on the road, and then they could return to employment. One woman in particular had also allowed her son to stay in his existing school where he was getting behavioral supports. So there's all of these spillover effects onto family members that we're seeing as well.
We're having an interesting conversation about social change with Claire Williams, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Foundation for Social Change and a professor at UBC, Dr. Jiaying Zhao, about a program where they gave $7,500 in cash upfront to homeless people and followed them to see how they did and what they did with it. And it sounds like the results were pretty successful. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Wire. We're on Saga 960. We're chatting with Claire Elizabeth Williams. She is the co-founder and CEO of the Foundation for Social Change. And we're also speaking with Dr. Jiaying Zhao, an associate professor of psychology at UBC's Institute of Resources, Environment and Sustainability. Dr. Zhao, maybe I could turn to you. I go back to your resume that I was given here, and it says that you use psychological principles to design behavioral solutions examining how resource scarcity impacts human cognitive and behavioral. What the heck are you talking about? How does psychological principles designing behavioral solutions affect resource scarcity and human cognition?
So my research is on the cognitive impacts of poverty. So what I showed
the cognitive impacts of poverty. So right. How your brain or how you think is impacted by
being in poverty.
Poor. Okay,
that's right.
Yeah.
So what we demonstrated before was just being in poverty reduces your cognitive function by about 13 points in IQ. So 13 points in IQ.
So it's so that your lower IQ doesn't cause poverty. It's the poverty causes a lower
poverty
IQ.
Causing lower cognitive functioning.
Really?
Yes.
Why?
Because you're stressed. Once you're stressed, your mind is bombarded by troubles and struggles and deadlines and bills and debts and loans and how are you going to pay for the next meal? So
in this study that Claire was doing when she gave them $7,500, did you test their IQ before and at the end?
We did. We found that the cash transfer resulted in an improvement in cognitive function.
Really?
Yes.
They became smarter.
They got smarter on our tests. Yes.
Okay. And this sounds like just an incredible area of study. Tell us more.
So this 13 points on IQ is basically the cognitive detriment you show after not sleeping for a night. It's the same detriment you show when you age 15 years from 45 to 60 years old. It's basically, it can classify you from average intelligence to borderline retardation. So this is the huge effect on the mind of poverty. So that's been my research in the past. And this cash transfer is one of the interventions that can not only lift people out of homelessness, but also improve their brain function.
How did you get interested in such a fascinating area of study?
Well, because I'm a psychologist. I'm a cognitive scientist in particular. So I study how the mind works. And poverty is one of those contexts that's really, detrimental to cognitive functioning.
What else is?
What's that?
What else is?
Lack of nutrition, discrimination, that's another one. Stereotypes, that are closely related to being in poverty again. Just knowing the fact that I'm in poverty or I'm poor can again reduce my cognitive functioning because I'm worried about how people are perceiving me.
Fascinating. And what about COVID-19? Has that impacted people's cognitive function? Has social isolation been a negative impact?
I have not seen any evidence on cognitive functioning, but I would say yes.
Unbelievable. Okay, so both of you found these unbelievably interesting findings that giving people $7,500 up front has a positive impact on their cognitive function, on what they do with the cash, on their lives. They go back to school, they get better housing, maybe they start entrepreneurial ventures, etc. What are you going to do with it?
We are now planning an expansion project. So we started our pilot project quite small, 50 people. That was the smallest statistically significant number we could have. Now we're expanding to 200 cash transfers, so deploying another project here in the Lower Mainland in early 2021. And then since going public, we have had inquiries from all over the world. We have a lot of interest from Toronto. So our hope is to scale this approach across the country.
And have you presented it to government?
Well, we got our initial funding from government and we presented our findings to government, and we haven't heard back from government. So when I say government, that's in a federal context. Provincially, we had been working with the NDP government, and they had provided us with a policy exemption so people could receive the cash as a gift as opposed to it being classified as income. And we just went through an election here in BC. So I'm hoping that they reach out and engage with us over the coming months, because I do think beyond a possible funding partnership, there are really important implications for how we disperse income assistance and just policy implications from a social policy perspective.
You said you excluded from the study people that had underlying substance abuse issues or mental health issues. And so I guess one could maybe say that you attacked people that were temporarily homeless, not people that had long-term homelessness because of mental health or substance abuse issues. Do you think that you need to try something different in that different segment?
I think we would like to, yeah. So we are not saying one way or another that it's not going to work for different subsets of the population. It's an open question that we would love to explore moving forward.
I interviewed another person who said that the homelessness issue was far worse in Indigenous communities. Did you study different races or different ethnic backgrounds in your survey?
Yeah, so we had 11% of our participants were Indigenous. That is much lower than the general quote unquote homeless population. The Indigenous population is about 36% of the general homeless population here in Vancouver. And so what we were finding is that the 4 organizations that we specifically worked with, Indigenous peoples were not staying there. So moving forward, we'll be working with more Indigenous specific shelters and friendship centers.
And what did you find anything different between those different subsets?
No, our sample size would be far too small to make any conclusive conclusions.
What about gender? Did you see any differences between gender?
No, we didn't.
Any differences in any other segmentation you may have done?
Yeah, we looked at age. We didn't find any kind of major demographic differences in our sample, but that's mostly because we had a small sample to start with.
Right.
So we need to replicate with a much larger sample.
And, come back to this idea of the upfront versus the 2,000 CERB a month, or the idea that Hugh Siegel has been talking about of a guaranteed annual income that would be instituted through the taxation system. Mm-hmm. Tell me why you think one is better than the other.
You mean direct cash transfers versus a universal basic income?
Yeah, and or universal basic income that might be a cash transfer versus via the tax system.
Yeah, I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other. I think the most creative and immediate ways that we can get help and money into people's hands, the better. I think they all have benefits. Like I said at the beginning, from our perspective as a charity, a direct cash transfer is just much more simple. It's direct and it's more elegant, meaning it's simple to implement, as opposed to a universal basic income is something that's usually done at a government level. And we just didn't have the capacity to do something like that.
What are the behavioral differences for someone that's given cash and is trusted to use the cash wisely versus someone that has to come and ask for, shelter and food and clothing separately? Either one of you.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have an answer, but I actually would like to re-listen to this podcast and write that down, because I think that would be a fascinating question for us to answer.
Yeah, so the traditional model is conditional, some form of conditional transfers. That could be rent assistance or provision of emergency services like housing or shelter housing. These conditional transfers improve outcomes in very specific domains to which the transfer is relevant. So for instance, if I give you rent assistance, that means you can only spend the money on rent, then obviously you're going to pay rent, right? So you can stay in housing for longer as a result. But unconditional cash transfers allow for greater improvements in human capital. So the positive impact is seen in a wider domains, so wider range of domains. So that's what we saw. We saw improvements in housing, in food security, in well-being, in cognitive function, in savings, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that conditional transfers cannot do. And so, I think, go ahead.
It was sort of a leading question because I had someone else in an interview say that when you treat people like children because you give them conditional transfers, because you're trying to control what they spend money on, because you don't trust that they're going to spend money wisely, then they act like children. And if you treat them like adults and trust that they're going to make wise decisions, they act like adults and make wise decisions.
Absolutely. They send a very different message.
Just a left-wing socialist kind of a ideological comment?
It's not. I mean, imagine if you were homeless, we're giving you $7,000, so 7,500. Would you want it to be conditional or unconditional?
I'd want it to be unconditional.
Precisely.
Because I might want to spend it on something that Claire, being my welfare consultant, doesn't think is the wisest thing for me to spend it on.
But that's up to you. We're giving you that level of agency, of freedom and dignity to make your own choices. Conditional transfers send the message that we don't trust you.
And so again, that's sort of an ideological belief. Do you actually think, have you done behavioral studies to prove that people feel that?
We have not. So we have not directly, but there has been tons and tons of studies in the past that compared the efficacies of conditional and unconditional transfers.
Yet so many people in government and so many people ideologically continue to want to have conditional transfers because they don't, who was it a little while ago that said they'll spend it on beer and whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a challenge and a call to action for government to start re-examining some of these harmful beliefs that they're basing public policy on. And there's no blame there. I think a lot of us are just programmed with these stereotypes, with these beliefs. There's this kind of zeitgeist that all human beings are inherently bad. And so if you think of people living in poverty or any kind of social welfare program, we make the burden of proof so high for people to get supports. People who want to go on disability. I have an invisible disability, and people with my illness are living like hand to mouth because they cannot get the disability insurance because government thinks they're lying. So there seems to be this acceptance that people are inherently going to lie or that we're bad. But the research and the data actually shows that's not true. And I'd encourage you and your listeners to read Rutger Bregman's latest book, Humankind, where he challenges a lot of those assumptions. And he has the hard science and the data to demonstrate everything we've been led to believe is wrong.
I had someone else on an interview tell me that part of the problem here is that there's too many people in the, I don't know what you call it, the social services sector, maybe like you, Claire, I'm not sure, that have an institutional desire to continue the current way that we're doing things. Because if we ended up just giving people money, there would be no need for all these different agencies that conditionally give out and all these different government bureaucracies that conditionally give out monies on it over time. And so therefore, by not trusting people and mandating that they go to this place and that place and this place and that place to collect their money for their different things, we actually employ a whole bunch of people in the social services sector that institutionally want to continue their jobs.
Yeah. And we're both nodding here. And again, not from a place of blame, but from a place of realization through our work. We have seen that there's the business of homelessness. There's the industrialization of poverty. Like you said, it keeps a lot of people in jobs, especially in government, a lot of administrative positions. And I find it disheartening when we should actually be trying to help people. Like our goal at Foundations for Social Change is to put ourselves out of business so that we don't need to have organizations like us anymore. Our goal is to amplify impact and empower people to move out of poverty. We're not interested in being in business. Jiaying and I will find something else to do.
How did you pick 7,500?
Great question. It is benchmarked against the 2016 income assistance rate in British Columbia. So that was the time of the study design. It was $610 a month. And so that was intentional because we think it has important policy implications for how we disperse income assistance. So is it better to give people these very small payments that allow them only just to survive? Or would it be better to front load all of that cash at the beginning to empower people to quickly move back into housing and become, quote unquote, productive members of society?
We're chatting tonight with Claire Williams, the co-founder and CEO of the Foundation for Social Change, and Professor Jie-Ying Zhao, professor at University of British Columbia, about a fascinating study that they did. Claire, with how many people? 2,000 people?
Oh, no, I wish we were doing it with 2,000 people. It was 50 cash transfers and 65 control.
50 people, where they gave them $7,500 upfront and followed them for, Jie-Ying, how long was it?
1 year.
Followed them for 1 year to see what the impact was, and it was a positive impact. And as Claire was saying, it calls into question a lot of our preconceived ideas about homelessness and homeless people and whether they can make good decisions with money or not. Anyway, we're going to take a break and come back with some final comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking about homelessness and social change and poverty and cognitive impacts of all this and the behavioral impacts of all this. And it's for me at least, a fascinating conversation because it really does call into question a lot of preconceived ideas that people might have in regards to homeless people and how best to give them money and how best to change their stars, to change their situation. And we're chatting with Professor Jie-Ying Zhao, professor at the University of British Columbia, and Claire Elizabeth Williams, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Foundation for Social Change. Claire and Jie-Ying, what's the future for your organization and for your study?
Yeah, so our next immediate plan is an expansion project here in Vancouver. So to expand our sample size to 200 people and also increase the amount of assistance. So we'll be giving $8,500 in this next project. That's to reflect the increase in income assistance that we've seen through the NDP government. And then after that, we want to keep expanding our parameters, working with different populations, people within the homeless population who perhaps have different needs and seeing if this is the right intervention for them. Also looking at working with people exiting the criminal justice system, people looking to exit sex trade, single moms. So basically, we're trying to empower everybody who is in poverty using direct cash transfers.
And Jie-Ying, Professor Zhao, apologize. When Claire goes through all these different groups that she'd like to include, will you be able to actually get sample sizes big enough that you'll be able to track these different almost demographic groups, people exiting the sex trade versus single moms versus people that have just been released from prison? Will you be able to track the different people to see if the impacts are different?
Absolutely, we can. We're able to track our participants for 1 year. Actually, we track some of them for 2 years. So that's our goal, and we have the capability to do that. The important thing is that we're not only focused on Vancouver, we're focusing on multiple cities across Canada. That includes Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, and Halifax. So we really want to capture that diversity of participants.
In your initial study, you excluded people that had addiction issues and mental health issues. Will you include some of them, Claire?
Not in the immediate expansion project, but I think moving forward. So one thing we are passionate about doing is working shoulder to shoulder with people who are in these circumstances that we're trying to empower. So again, trying to break away from these paternalistic approaches where we as decision makers decide what's best for people. We're actually going to have focus groups with some of these individuals who may have different needs to find out, is this the right intervention for you? If it is, what else would you need in order to be successful? So that is an open question that we're excited to explore.
Professor Zhao, do you think that the behavioral difference is going to be dramatically different within those subsegments? Is that why you're excluding people with mental health issues and addiction issues?
No, I don't think. Well, there's an open question. Nobody has the answer. But I certainly hope that this cash transfer will help many people that won't have access otherwise.
Are you doing this study, you said in Vancouver primarily so far, and the next stage as well? Do you think it's going to be different in a rural, suburban versus urban environment, or is it going to be the same?
Again, we don't have data, but my prediction is that if there are supportive housing units in rural areas, that is when if people can actually find housing, then yes, this approach should work. I think, that's why we actually deliberately included Halifax in our expansion plan to capture that sample.
Claire, I think one of the biggest challenges we have in Canada is our treatment of our Indigenous communities. Have you thought about any specific study that you could do in primarily Indigenous communities?
We have, absolutely, and we have received an inquiry from a local group here, so we're in the process of investigating what that could look like.
And would that be still in an urban environment or in a reserve?
I think it would depend on the nation or the band that you worked with. So very different circumstances. There's a lot of urban Indigenous peoples here in Vancouver, in Winnipeg, but poverty very much exists on Indian land within the bands. I used to work in Indigenous consultation. And so some of the conditions I saw were deplorable. They were comparable to third world. So I definitely think that this is something that all populations could benefit from.
You said at the top that you were running an orphanage in India.
Yeah, I was helping manage an orphanage in India. So that was in 2015. So they're working with, 86 kids from ages 3 to 19.
Must have been an interesting experience.
It was an interesting experience. It was a hard experience. It's incredibly challenging to see people who have gone through such harrowing and traumatic experiences. But it was also inspiring to see the resilience of the human spirit. And I think that's something that we also see in the participants in our study. Some of them have been through things that I just could not imagine, but they still have courage and they still have resilience and they still have hope. And that's what drives us forward.
Resilience and hope. I think we all need a little bit of resilience and hope during this time.
Yes, I would agree.
Yep. Well, Professor Jieying Zhao and Claire Elizabeth Williams, co-founder and CEO of the Foundation for Social Change and professor at UBC. Thank you both so much for joining us on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I really appreciate it. And good luck, because I think that you're actually having huge impact. And I hope that the cognitive impact that Professor Zhao has talked about and the social impact that Claire Elizabeth Williams has talked about will have a huge impact on Canadian society. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Well, that's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. We can be found Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on Saga 960 AM, or stream us online on www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and videocasts after the fact on briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.